The flashing red and blue lights pierced through the darkness, reflecting off the damp pavement. A lone car sat at the side of the road, its engine humming softly, as the sharp click of boots echoed in the silence. Inside the car, 17-year-old Marcus Carter gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His heart pounded against his ribs, every beat reminding him of the stories he'd heard, stories that never ended well. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. Outside, Officer Mitchell tightened his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he approached the vehicle. His hand rested instinctively on his holster. Another punk out past curfew. Another excuse. He had seen it too many times. As he rapped on the window, Marcus hesitated before rolling it down, his movements slow, deliberate. "License and registration," the officer barked. Marcus nodded, reaching into the glove compartment. His fingers trembled as they brushed against something unexpected, an envelope. His late father's handwriting stared back at him. "For when you're scared." The city of Ridgewood was a place of stark contrasts. By day, it pulsed with life, children laughing in neighborhood parks, street vendors serving up sizzling hot dogs, and families strolling past small businesses that had stood for generations. But by night, the atmosphere shifted. The streets grew quieter, the air heavier, and the flashing lights of police cars became an all-too-familiar sight. For Marcus Carter, this was home. A 17-year-old high school senior with a bright future, Marcus was the kind of student teachers raved about. Polite, hardworking, and always willing to help. His passion? Basketball. He lived for the rhythmic bounce of the ball against the court, the rush of adrenaline as he went for a layup, the roar of the crowd when he sank the winning shot. He had dreams, big ones. A college scholarship was within reach, and if things went right, he could be the first in his family to make it out of Ridgewood's struggling neighborhoods. But dreams didn't erase reality. His mother, Angela Carter, worked double shifts. As a nurse, exhaustion etched into her face each night when she came home. She often reminded Marcus of the rules. Keep your hands where they can see them, be respectful, never argue, and if you ever feel scared, read what your father left you. His father, James Carter, had been a guiding force in his life, a man of wisdom and quiet strength. A former community leader, he had always believed in justice even when it didn't believe in him. 3 years ago, a tragic accident took him away, leaving Marcus and his mother with only memories. And a single letter sealed in an envelope. His father's final words meant for a moment of fear. Marcus never thought he'd need it. On the other side of town, Officer Daniel Mitchell sat in his squad car, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He had been a cop for over a decade, patrolling these streets long enough to know their rhythms. To him, Ridgewood wasn't a place of dreams. It was a place of broken promises. Crime, gangs, drugs. It was a cycle, and he had long stopped believing it could change. His partner, Officer Greg Saunders, glanced over. "You good, man?" Mitchell exhaled sharply. "Yeah, just another long night." But there was something else, something deeper. The weight of the job, the years of hardened experience, the silent judgments he made before even flipping on his sirens. He told himself he was just being cautious, just doing his job. But deep down, something in him was cracking. When the call came in, an old sedan speeding through a red light, Mitchell sighed. "Let's handle it." As he flicked on the sirens and accelerated down the road, neither man knew that this stop would be different, that a single piece of paper tucked away in a glove compartment would challenge everything they thought they knew. The night air felt heavier as Marcus unfolded the letter, his fingers trembling slightly. The familiar handwriting of his late father stared back at him, but before he could read a single word, "Step out of the vehicle." The command was sharp, unwavering. Officer Mitchell stood rigid, his right hand resting near his holster. His eyes scanned Marcus with a mix of suspicion and authority. Marcus's breath hitched. He had done nothing wrong, he knew that. But that didn't matter. Not here. Not now. His mother's words echoed in his head. Stay calm. Don't argue. Be respectful. Slowly, he placed the letter back in the glove compartment and raised his hands. Officer, I said step out of the car now. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements slow, deliberate. As he pushed the door open and stood, the flashing lights from the squad car painted his skin in harsh reds and blues. The world felt smaller, like a stage where only he and Officer Dare Mitchell existed, the weight of history pressing in on them. Mitchell took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. You ran a red light. Marcus frowned. I don't think I did. Mitchell let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job? Marcus felt his chest tighten. No, sir. I thought it was yellow. Officer Saunders, still by the patrol car, crossed his arms. License and registration? It's in the glove compartment, Marcus answered. He motioned toward the car. Can I? Mitchell stiffened, his fingers twitching near his holster. Slowly. Marcus nodded, stepping back toward the car. He reached inside with exaggerated caution, his hands moving as if in slow motion. His fingers brushed against the letter again, but he pushed it aside, grabbing his wallet instead. He pulled out his license and handed it over. Mitchell examined it, his expression unreadable. Where you headed? Home, Marcus answered. Just left my friend's house. Mitchell's gaze flickered over the inside of the car. You been drinking? Marcus's jaw clenched. No, sir. Saunders took a step closer. Mind if we check your car? Marcus hesitated. He knew his rights, but he also knew what happened when you pushed back. His mother's tired. Face flashed in his mind. Come home safe, baby. That's all that matters. I don't have anything to hide. His voice was steady, but inside a storm brewed. Mitchell nodded to Saunders, who stepped forward, yanking open the driver's side door. He started rummaging through the back seat. Marcus watched, his stomach knotting. This isn't right, then. What's this? Saunders pulled out a small cloth bag from the center console. He held it up like it was a trophy. Marcus's eyes widened. That's my gym bag. Mitchell snatched it, pulling the zipper open. His eyes darkened. Marcus's heart pounded. Wait, what's in there? Mitchell reached inside, pulling out a small plastic bag filled with white powder. Marcus's world tilted. No, 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 no. That's not mine. His voice cracked, panic seeping into his words. I swear, I don't even... Mitchell grabbed his wrist, spinning him around. Before Marcus could react, his arms were wrenched behind his back. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. Click, click. Marcus's chest caved in. No, please, that's not mine. I don't... Yeah? Then how'd it get in your car? Mitchell's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. Marcus struggled, his breathing rapid. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. His mind raced, trying to piece together how, why. Saunders smirked. Another punk off the streets. Mitchell pulled Marcus toward the squad car, but as he did, something caught his eye. The letter still sitting in the glove compartment. He hesitated. Something about it. Something about Marcus's sheer panic, the desperation in his voice. It unsettled him. This kid wasn't acting like a criminal. He was acting like a kid who had just been blindsided. Mitchell took a breath. He didn't know why he did it, but he reached into the car and grabbed the letter. For when you're scared. The words on the envelope struck something deep inside him. His grip on Marcus's arm loosened slightly. What is this? He muttered. Marcus, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths, turned. It's from my dad, he whispered. Mitchell looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time that night. The arrogance, the assumptions, the years of seeing the same thing over and over again, they all started to waver. Mitchell swallowed, hard, his fingers hesitating over the envelope seal. And then, he tore it open. As he unfolded the letter, the words inside made his breath hitch, and for the first time in his career, Officer Mitchell felt something he hadn't in a long time. The night air was thick with tension, pressing down on Marcus like a weight he couldn't shake. His wrists throbbed in the cold steel of the handcuffs. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his heart pounded against his ribcage like it was trying to break free. The world had gone silent except for the rustling of paper as Officer Mitchell unfolded the letter. The squad car's flashing lights painted everything in harsh red and blue, their glow flickering across Marcus's terrified face and Mitchell's furrowed brow. The letter was worn, its edges creased from years of being carried, saved, and protected. Mitchell's eyes scanned the first lines, and his breath caught in his throat. "Son, if you're reading this, it means you're in a situation where you feel trapped, afraid, or powerless. I need you to remember something. You are strong, you are worthy, and no matter what happens, do not let fear decide who you are." Mitchell's grip on the paper tightened. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He read on. "The world may not always see you the way I do. There will be people who judge you before they know you. There will be moments when you are accused, blamed, or even feared for no reason other than the color of your skin. But son, listen to me. Do not let their fear define you." Marcus was staring at him now, his lips slightly parted, his chest still heaving. Mitchell's hands trembled as he turned to the next lines. "To the man holding this letter, I ask you this. Do you see my son, or do you see only what you've been told to expect?" A chill ran down Mitchell's spine. He felt the words burrow into his chest like they had been written just for him. His mind flashed back to every stop he had made in this part of town, every time he had assumed the worst, every time he had let fear and frustration shape his decisions. He suddenly felt exposed. Saunders scoffed, breaking the silence. "What is that? Some kind of sob story?" He turned back to Marcus with a sneer. "Nice try, kid, but a sweet letter from Daddy doesn't change what's in that bag." Marcus's eyes burned with frustration. "That's not mine. I don't know how it got there." Mitchell's gaze flickered between Marcus and the bag of powder. His instincts, the ones that had guided him for over a decade, told him not to question it. He had seen this too many times before, but now something in him was questioning it. He looked at the young man in front of him, the genuine fear in his eyes, the way his entire body screamed desperation, the way his hands still shook despite being cuffed. Something was wrong. Mitchell's jaw clenched. He turned toward Saunders. "Where'd you find that?" Saunders rolled his eyes. "In his console, why?" Mitchell's brows furrowed. "You searched it without probable cause?" Saunders waved a dismissive hand. Kid said he had nothing to hide. Mitchell hesitated. His gut twisted. Years on the force had made him trust procedure, but years on the force had also made him blind to the people behind it. He had stopped seeing them, stopped questioning whether he was always right. He looked at Marcus again, then back at the letter. His fingers traced over the words. "Do you see my son?" Mitchell let out a shaky breath. He turned toward Saunders, his voice lower now. "Something's off." Saunders frowned. "What?" Mitchell's throat tightened. He didn't know why, but suddenly he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his chest. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need a background check on Marcus Carter." Marcus blinked. "What?" Mitchell held up a hand, signaling him to wait. The radio crackled. "Carter, Marcus, 17, no priors, clean record." Mitchell's grip on the radio tightened. No priors, no history, no reason to assume he was lying. His stomach twisted. Marcus was shaking his head, his voice cracking. "I didn't do this. You have to believe me." And for the first time, that night, Mitchell did. He turned toward Saunders, his jaw tight. "Uncuff him." Saunders scoffed. "You serious?" "Now." A beat of silence. Then, reluctantly, Saunders reached for the key. The cuffs popped open, and Marcus staggered, forward, rubbing his wrists. Mitchell turned back toward the squad car, his mind racing. If the bag wasn't Marcus's, that meant A thought struck him, a terrible, gut-wrenching thought. Someone planted it. His pulse quickened. Where was the car before he got in? Marcus hesitated. I left it outside my friend's house for a while. I wasn't watching it. Mitchell exhaled sharply. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a setup. His hands balled into fists. How many times had he been the one to write kids like Marcus off? To assume guilt without a second thought? To believe that every young black man he pulled over was just another criminal waiting to happen? But tonight, he had almost ruined an innocent kid's life. His breath hitched. The letter still trembled in his hands. His eyes fell to the final lines. You have the power to break the cycle. You just have to see him first. Mitchell swallowed hard. He turned back to Marcus. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Marcus stiffened. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. Mitchell looked away. The weight of the moment was suffocating. His voice cracked. He shook his head, gripping the bridge of his nose. I was wrong. Marcus's throat bobbed. His hands curled into fists. He should have been relieved. He should have felt some kind of peace. But all he felt was exhaustion, because this wasn't new. This was his reality. Saunders scoffed. From the side. What? We're just letting him go now? Mitchell turned to him, his eyes dark. You got a problem with that? Saunders bristled. Get in the car, Mitchell snapped. For once, Saunders said nothing. He shot Marcus a final glare before walking off. Mitchell turned back toward Marcus. We'll find out who put that in your car, he said. I swear. Marcus didn't respond at first. His throat was too tight. Then finally, I just want to go home. Mitchell nodded. He stepped back, motioning toward the car. Marcus exhaled sharply, glancing one last time at the letter still clutched in Mitchell's hands. Then, without another word, he climbed back into his car and drove off, disappearing into the night. Mitchell stood there for a long time, the letter still trembling in his hands. The words echoed in his head. Do you see my son? And for the first time in years, Mitchell realized he finally had. The road stretched endlessly ahead of Marcus as he drove home, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The weight of the night clung to him like a second skin, unshakable, suffocating. His heartbeat was no longer erratic, but the fear hadn't disappeared. It never really did. His mother's words from earlier that evening echoed in his head. Come home safe. Baby, that's all that matters. Tonight he almost hadn't. He pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his home usually offering comfort. But not tonight. He sat in the car for a long time, gripping the wheel, staring at his trembling hands. His father's letter had saved him. A few words on a fragile piece of paper had stopped a cop from ruining his life. But what about the ones who didn't have a letter? What about the ones who weren't believed? He exhaled shakily, finally stepping out of the car. The moment he shut the door, the porch light flicked on. His mother stood in the doorway, wrapped in her nightrobe, her eyes wide with worry. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She already knew. Marcus barely made it up the steps before she pulled him into her arms. He let out a shuddering breath, the weight of everything crashing into him all at once. I was so scared, he whispered, his voice breaking. She held him tighter. I know, baby. I know. Meanwhile, Officer Mitchell sat in his squad, car staring at Marcus's father's letter, reading the words over and over again. For years he had convinced himself that he was just doing his job, that the people he arrested were already guilty in some way, that his instincts were never wrong. Tonight shattered that illusion. The guilt gnawed at him. His entire career had been built on certainty, but for the first time, he wasn't sure anymore. He looked at Saunders in the passenger seat, the other officer scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened, like tonight was just another shift. Where'd the drugs really come from? Mitchell finally asked, his voice quiet but sharp. Saunders scoffed. Why does it matter? Kid's free, isn't he? Mitchell clenched his jaw. That's not an answer. Saunders didn't even look up. You need to stop thinking so hard about this, man. Mitchell's stomach turned. How many times had this happened? How many times had he ignored the truth because it was easier? Mitchell took a deep breath. Then, in one swift motion, he reached for his radio. Dispatch, I need to file an official report regarding the unlawful search and seizure of evidence on a minor. Saunders's head snapped up. Mitchell, what the hell are you doing? Mitchell ignored him. Requesting an internal investigation into Officer Saunders. Possible evidence tampering. Saunders's face twisted with anger. Are you serious? Mitchell turned to him, his expression unreadable. You planted it, didn't you? Saunders let out a dry laugh. I don't know what you're talking about. Mitchell exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You don't even care, do you? Saunders leaned back, crossing his arms. And what do you care, huh? You gonna ruin your career over some punk kid? Mitchell's grip tightened around the letter in his hand. You have the power to break the cycle. For the first time in his career, he realized what that meant. I'm done looking the other way, he said. The radio crackled. Copy that, Officer Mitchell. Internal Affairs will review your report. Saunders' expression darkened, but he said nothing. He didn't have to. Mitchell already knew. Tonight, a line had been drawn, and there was no going back. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at his father's letter. His mother sat beside him, her fingers tracing the edges of the worn paper. Your father was always thinking ahead, she murmured. He knew you'd need this one day. Marcus swallowed hard. Yeah, he did. A knock at the door startled them. His mother stood, peeking through the window. Then, her face hardened. It's that cop. Marcus tensed. He didn't know whether to feel fear or anger, but before he could decide, she opened the door. Officer Mitchell stood there, his expression unreadable. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain button-down shirt and jeans, looking strangely human. I just came to say, he started, shifting awkwardly. Saunders has been suspended. Internal Affairs is investigating. He won't be planning anything on anyone for a long time. Marcus studied him carefully. He looked different, like he had been carrying something heavy for years and had finally set it down. And you? Marcus asked. Mitchell let out a slow breath. I don't know. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Marcus. Marcus unfolded it and frowned. It was Mitchell's resignation letter. I can't change what I've done, Mitchell said quietly. But I can make sure I don't keep doing it. Marcus didn't know what to say. He had spent his whole life preparing for nights like the one that almost took everything from him. But he had never imagined a cop choosing to walk away. Mitchell cleared his throat. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then finally, he nodded. Mitchell turned to leave. But just before he reached the sidewalk, Marcus called out, Hey! Mitchell stopped, glancing back. You saw me, Marcus said. That's a start. Mitchell's throat tightened. He gave a small nod. Then he walked away. Marcus watched him go, then looked down at his father's letter again. The words didn't feel like just words anymore. They felt like hope. The story of Marcus and Officer Mitchell is not just an isolated incident. It reflects a much larger issue embedded within society. The themes of racial profiling, systemic injustice, and personal accountability are deeply relevant to the ongoing struggle for equity and fairness in law enforcement. This incident forces us to ask hard questions. How many young people like Marcus live in fear of an encounter with the police? How many officers like Mitchell have ignored their conscience for the sake of preserving the status quo? And most importantly, how do we break this cycle? These questions don't have simple answers, but they demand attention, reflection, and most importantly, action. Marcus's experience is not fiction for many people. It's a lived reality. Studies have shown that black drivers are disproportionately stopped by police compared to white drivers. A 2020 study by the Stanford Open Policing Project analyzed nearly 100 million traffic stops and found that black drivers were more likely to be pulled over and more likely to be searched, despite being less likely to be found with contraband than white drivers. This pattern reflects deep-seated biases, whether implicit or explicit. Officers like Saunders, who plant evidence or manipulate facts, are not just individual bad apples. They are symptoms of a larger systemic problem that allows such misconduct to go unchecked. Marcus's story also highlights another reality. Many victims of police misconduct don't get justice. If not for his father's letter, Marcus might have become another statistic, wrongfully arrested, branded a criminal, and forced to navigate a broken system that disproportionately punishes people of color. But what happens to those who don't have a letter to prove their innocence? What happens when there's no camera, no witness, no undeniable evidence to expose the truth? For many, justice never comes. Marcus's fear in the story is visceral because it reflects the real emotional toll of racial profiling. His mother's words, "Just come home safe," represent a heartbreaking truth. For many black families, safety is not guaranteed. This isn't just paranoia, it's survival. Imagine living with the knowledge that a simple traffic stop could cost you your life. Imagine having to teach your children not just to respect authority, but to navigate encounters with police as if their lives depend on it. Because they do. Research from the American Psychological Association has shown that repeated exposure to racial profiling and police violence contributes to chronic stress, anxiety, and PTSD in black communities. These experiences create a cycle of fear, anger, and distrust that erodes faith in law enforcement. And when people lose faith in the system, society as a whole suffers. Officer Mitchell's character arc raises another important question. Can individual officers change? At first, Mitchell represents a common problem. Officers who uphold a broken system, not necessarily out of hatred, but out of complacency. He doesn't question his role until he's forced to confront an undeniable truth. He nearly destroyed an innocent life. His transformation is significant, but it also highlights an uncomfortable reality. Most officers do not face such moments of reckoning. Instead, many shield themselves with the infamous blue wall of silence, a culture within law enforcement that discourages officers from speaking out against wrongdoing. Officers who break this code often face backlash, alienation, or even retaliation from their own colleagues. This is why reform must go beyond individual conscience. It has to be systemic. The end of Marcus's story offers a glimmer of hope. Mitchell chose to walk away from a corrupt system, proving that change is possible, even within law enforcement. But one officer choosing to change is not enough. Justice should not depend on luck. Marcus should not have needed a letter to be believed. And until every young black person can drive without fear of being profiled, the fight is not over. This is where we come in. We have the power to demand change. We have the power to hold corrupt officers accountable. We have the power to educate ourselves and others. Marcus's father was right. We have the power to break the cycle. The only question is, will we? Marcus's story is one of many. A painful reminder that justice is not always guaranteed, that innocence is not always enough, and that the color of one's skin can still determine the course of their fate. But it is also a story of hope. It proves that change is possible, that people, even those complicit in the system, can wake up, and that the cycle of injustice can be broken. Yet, change does not happen in silence. Change does not come from waiting for the system to fix itself. Imagine a world where no parent has to fear for their child's safety during a routine traffic stop. Imagine a world where officers serve and protect all people equally, where justice is not a privilege but a right. That world is not impossible, it is not a fantasy. It is a reality that we can create step by step, voice by voice, action by action. The question is, will we fight for it? Marcus's father left a letter that changed the course of one officer's life. But today, we don't need just one letter. We need a movement. We need people who refuse to accept a broken system. We need people who are ready to stand up, speak out, and demand justice. We need you. So, if this story moved you, don't just watch. Take action. Share your thoughts in the comments. Start conversations. Be the change. Because together we can break the cycle. Together we can build a better future. The time is now. He hesitated, his breath hitching. Should he open it? Officer Mitchell tapped his flashlight against the window, irritation creeping into his voice. I said. Marcus unfolded the note. His father's words stared back at him. And in that moment, everything changed.